Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous.
This week, our president told 4 members of Congress to go back where they came from. The president is not big on fact-checking, so he missed a simple truth. One of these women was born in Chicago, one was born in Detroit, and one was born in the Bronx. Only one was born outside the United States, Representative Ilhan Omar, who lived in Somalia until she was 12 years old. Since Donald Trump is the opposite of everything this nation stands for, it may be time to send Trump back to where he came from. Yes, can someone please send Donald Trump back to Queens, or back to Scotland, where his mother, an immigrant, came from, or back to Germany, where his grandfather came from, or back to Slovenia, where his current wife came from, or back to Moscow, where his ideas and his campaign support came from. Just, please God, do not allow this stain on the fabric of humanity, Donald Trump, to continue to ravage the values of the United States of America. But those who leapt to the defense of the 4 congresswomen, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley, made a mistake that was also disgusting, dangerous, and most of all, racist. The supporters of this foursome that calls itself the Squad have been hoodwinked by a new racism that uses the phrase people of color. This new breed of racists labeled Trump's words as racist. But what Trump said was not racist. It was bigoted. It was xenophobic. It was stupid. It was disgusting. It was the outburst of a 6th grade schoolyard bully, an ignorant 6th grade bully. And it was profoundly un-American. But it was not racist. Look, there is no racial commonality between Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. No commonality except in the eyes of a new philosophy that is as racist as they get. That new philosophy is behind the phrases people of color and women of color. And to repeat, that new philosophy is deeply racist. It is racist against whites, and it is racist against Jews. Of all the racisms of the last 300 years, 2 have done the most damage. One was the racism against blacks. That racism justified slavery. Slavery killed off nearly 2 million Africans before their time in the transportation across the Atlantic from Africa to the American South. The other mass killer was the racism against Jews. That racism killed off 6 million Jews in a mere 4 years, 3 times the number of black deaths in the despicable African-American slave trade. Look, I'm Jewish, so I'd rather not see that sort of thing happen again, not to any people on this planet, which is why I tried to stop the Hutu-Tutsi massacre at its very beginning in 1981. But that's another story for another time. Modern racism started in 1853 with the publication of an essay on the inequality of the human races by Joseph Arthur de Gobineau. Gobineau claimed that the relationships between races drive history, and he claimed that race was biological. He divided humanity into 3 biological categories: white, yellow, and black. History springs only from contact with the white races, he claimed. In other words, the only races capable of imparting civilization were white. At the top of the white races, in Gobineau's opinion, were the Aryans. Said Gobineau, mixing races led to the fall of civilizations. Strangely, Gobineau thought highly of Jews. Jews, he said, became a people that succeeded in everything it undertook, a free, strong, and intelligent people. But when Gobineau's theories made it into the hands of Adolf Hitler, Hitler compared Jews to vermin, insects, and a disease. Blacks did not go over well with Hitler either, but Hitler did like Arabs. He liked them, cozied up to them, and subsidized them. Why? Because some of them shared Hitler's desire to exterminate Jews. How did Muslims and Arabs get into this discussion? Because it was an Arab of wealth who came up with the idea of people of color. He came up with the notion that Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have something deep in common. He came up with the idea that American blacks and Muslims are victims of the same oppression. He came up with the idea that if you can show your people were once victimized by white imperialism, you were part of an elite high above white Westerners. Oh, and he also showed that you should be anti-Semitic. He also implied that you should tilt toward the eradication of Israel. Who invented the idea of people of color? This intellectual monster's name was Edward Said. And strangely, Edward Said shared something with Donald Trump. He was a liar. Here's the story of Edward Said as it's told in the peer-reviewed World Affairs Journal by Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies expert, scholar, Joshua Moravchik. Explains Moravchik, Edward Said came from a privileged background. Said's father had immigrated from Jerusalem to the United States in 1911, had served in the American military in World War I, and had become an American citizen. It appears his family pressured Said's father to come back to the Middle East, something he did not want to do. Nonetheless, Edward Said's father settled in Cairo, married a local Egyptian girl, and made a hefty amount of money in the stationery business. So Said grew up as a little prince. His family had its own box at the opera and memberships in country clubs. From the beginning, Said's father worked to make little Edward a part of English-speaking culture, not a part of the Middle East. Said was raised in Cairo's Anglican church, had piano lessons, and was sent to Cairo's American and British schools. Said's classmates included actor Omar Sharif and the future King of Jordan. That lasted until young Edward was 15 years old. Then his dad demonstrated just how badly he wanted his son Edward to be a part of the English-speaking world's elite. He sent the 15-year-old Said to an exclusive private boarding school in the USA, Massachusetts Mount Hermon School. From there, Said went to Princeton and Harvard, the cream of America's elite universities. Then, when it came time to get a job, Said landed a position teaching literary criticism at another upscale Ivy League school, Columbia University, where he rose to a coveted university professorship, Columbia's highest rank. But this is not how Said told the tale of his origins. Instead, he claimed that he was a Palestinian refugee. He claimed that he had been raised in Jerusalem and that he had been forced out of his family's home and driven into exile when the nation of Israel was born in 1948. Yes, Edward Said claimed he had been forcibly expelled from his home by Jews, by Zionists. This was a total fabrication, or to put it more bluntly, like Donald Trump's lies, it too was a lie. And Edward Said did not just mutter this false biography furtively, he shouted it. He told this false tale on a BBC documentary in 1998 called In Search of Palestine. Where does the phrase people of color fit into this? Edward Said's first two books were Orientalism and The Question of Palestine. They were enormous campus hits. Says Moravchik, Said's books were assigned reading in 868 courses in American colleges and universities, ranging from literary criticism, politics, and anthropology to Middle East studies. What's more, says Moravchik, more than 40 books have been published about Edward Said, including the Cambridge Introduction to Edward Said. You can't get more prestigious than that. Schools like Georgetown University and UCLA offer entire courses about Edward Said, and England's The Guardian cited Edward Said as arguably the most influential intellectual of our time. What's more, an entire discipline was founded on Edward Said's ideas, post-colonial studies. One basic theme of Edward Said's books was that the Caucasian race was the scourge of humanity. The Caucasian race, said Said, was responsible for the sins of imperialism and colonialism. But Said's idea is thoroughly racist. Said condemns an entire people just because of the color of their skin. But that's not Said's only racist idea. He came up with the phrase people of color. In Said's mind, people of color are not humans united by their skin color or by their cultural background. They are not a people united, as racists thought, by biology. People of color are united by their victimization. Let me repeat that. People of color are united by their victimization. People of color are united as winners of what writer Roxane Gay calls the Oppression Olympics, the competitive pity party. Moravchik explains that Said rolled the American racism and European colonialism into one melange of white oppression of darker-skinned peoples, and kids on college campuses and their professors were hungry for self-blame. They were hungry for whips with which to lacerate themselves, hungry to blame all the world's evils on their parents and themselves. Or as Moravchik puts it, it was a time when it was widely asserted that all white people were inherently bigoted, and encounter groups met at campuses and workplaces so that whites could discover and confront their inner racist. So Edward Said became a campus craze. But Edward Said's biggest trick was to suddenly make Muslims and American blacks part of the same group. And he united blacks and Muslims in hating the one people who have suffered the greatest mass murder in history, the Jews. He united blacks and Muslims against the greatest victims of racism and oppression this planet has ever seen. All of this was ironic. Said, as I said, was a liar. He made a slew of massive historical mistakes in his work, but his greatest sin was a cover-up. Islam, the religion of Muslims, has been the greatest imperialist and colonialist force in world history. In the 100 years after Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Islam used mass murder, terror, and torture to take a territory 11 times the size of the conquests of Alexander the Great, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire, and 3 times the size of the United States. And Islam created oppression to the nth degree. To rule, Islam used murder, terror, and torture, the same tools that Islam had used for conquest. And Islam went further in its oppression. It tried to exterminate indigenous cultures in countries like Egypt, Iran, and India. In fact, Islam's 1,500 years of colonialism and imperialism make the West's mere 500 years of imperialism and colonialism look like a blip. What's more, to this very day, you can be killed for blasphemy against Islam in many of the Muslim world's 57 nations. You can also be killed for being LGBTQ, and if you are a woman, God help you. That is oppression on a grand scale. Meanwhile, do Western blacks and the world's Muslims have anything in common? In fact, Arabs have been oppressors of black peoples for a whopping 1,800 years. In approximately 200 AD, the Arabs saw Africa as a wholesale source of slaves. For the next 1,600 years, the Arabs traded black African slaves, selling them from the slave markets of the Pacific Rim to the slave markets on the shores of the Atlantic, 6,900 miles away. Many of those male African slaves were castrated before they were sold. For every African captured and sold in the Western slave trade, the Arab slave trade captured and sold 10. Yes, the Islamic slave trade, the Muslim slave trade, was 10 times the size of the Western slave trade. So Muslims have been the oppressors of blacks, not their champions. It's the West and those cursed white people who invented anti-slavery and anti-imperialist movements and set subjugated countries free. Yes, Western civilization invented something jaw-dropping: anti-slavery and anti-imperialism movements. Meanwhile, Islam is still on the march, trying to take new territory and attempting to oppress people in places like Nigeria, Mali, and the Sudan. Islam is still an oppressor. So the phrase people of color masks a political agenda, a subversive and dishonest political agenda. And that agenda is deeply racist. It is racist against whites, and it is racist against Jews, which means that when Donald Trump says, "Love it or leave it," and send them back home, his words are nasty, loathsome, and bigoted, but they are not racist. The real racists are those who have swallowed Edward Said's invention, the lumping of Muslims and blacks together as people of color, and the lumping of Muslims and blacks together as anti-Semites. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future. It is your job and my job to make. Or, want to know why? Ask how. And now, for that sneaky, sleazy, slimy, sibilant little off button.